My name is Mike France. I'm currently finishing my second term as the state representative for the 42nd District, representing Ledyard, Preston, and Montville. Prior to that, I served 3 years on the Ledyard Town Council as the Finance Committee Chair. I serve in the legislature on 3 committees: the Appropriations Committee, Government Administration and Elections, and Planning and Development.
A local issue, Ledyard having to pass a supplemental tax increase because they saw cuts in education. What happened there?
Well, the issue there was in the budget that was passed, the compromise budget, there was a $200 million unallocated lapse. There was about $900 million in total lapses, but the legislature only defined about $700 million of those roughly. And so there was an agreement between the leadership on both the Republican and Democrat side with the governor. But as you know, if you don't put it in statute, the governor is not obligated to it. And my understanding is as he went to go resolve this $200 million that he needed to cut as directed by the legislature, he was not comfortable with the agreement of wherever that money was supposed to come from between the leadership and there, and he ended up taking that $200 million from elsewhere, of which about $80 million was from municipal aid, including $51 million from education. And that was on top of the $31 million the legislature had already cut. So in the case of Ledyard, it was on top of the $600,000 that was cut by the legislature, it was another $960,000. And they had already made whatever cuts they thought they could affordably, and then the council and the Board of Ed resolved that the only way they could come through it was to put a supplemental tax bill out, which was a one-time 1 mil tax, which raises about $1 million based on the mill rate.
Is there anything you could have done or tried to do or might have been done to kind of avoid that, or is it just was the product of the budget?
No, I think the legislature has a responsibility to clearly define where money, if you're going to cut from state government, it should be defined in statute. In this case, as I said, about $900 million in lapses or cuts from the executive side of the budget. We only defined $700 million. We should have defined whatever this agreement was between leadership and the governor. Should have been put in statute. Where they came to that agreement, should have been put in statute. And because it wasn't, that gave the governor leeway to do what he needed to do to balance the budget. I don't like the choice that he made, but that was certainly within his purview to do.
And just remind me, we had the Republican budget, which I assume you supported, that
Yes, sir.
was passed with a few Democratic votes.
Correct. We had 3 senators and 5 Democrat House members.
And then the governor vetoed that. And,
Correct.
And it never came to a vote in the House. They counted the heads and they weren't going to override.
I don't believe there was sufficient support to override, and so that began about a 30-day period of time where initially the leadership worked with the governor, and then for the last 2 weeks, the 4 leaders got together with their staffs and put together the compromise budget that was brought forward in October.
Did you end up supporting that?
I did not.
You did not?
I did not. It was
And why was that?
2 principal reasons. One, there was a $300 million increase in spending. They couldn't explain how they were paying for it. And secondly was the cuts to education. We had put in a new education cost share formula, which is something that the towns had been complaining about, was the lack of consistency and the lack of actually using the formula that was in statute. The legislature, as part of the compromise, the Republicans had put forward this new cost share formula that would phase in over 10 years. And so what they did is they didn't want to make a dramatic shift in funding for the municipalities, and so they phased that in over 10 years because there was anywhere from roughly 50% of eligible money to over 150%. So it was a wide variance over time because of a policy that the legislature had for many, many years of hold harmless. So even though towns may have had a reduction in student body count in their district, the legislature refused to reduce the education cost share grant, which the formula is tied to student population. And based on that, you had towns that were not in keeping with the formula. So in order to be fair, really, to towns to not have to deal with a substantial change in 1 year, it was phased over 10 years. Well, that's still in the process, but the demands in the compromise language were to cut $31 million from education. And given that we were already in the year, we'd already started the school year, we'd made commitments, obviously there were verbal commitments on what the towns would receive. I did not think it was fair to turn around and take that $31 million from the towns. Now we held the alliance districts harmless, so the bottom 30 performing school districts, 33 actually, there were 3 additional ones. But even with that, that takes about 3/4 of the state and makes a cut after the school year's already started. They've already planned their budget based on a commitment from the state, and I think that was unfair.
Well, it sounds like you were looking at bigger issues. Did you also kind of know that your towns might be vulnerable the way they were doing this?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the 3 towns that represent Ledyard, Preston, and Montville are pretty much the same as far as the percentage cut that was made. In fact, the budgets for both Montville and Ledyard are virtually identical as far as the numbers, and so their reductions were about the same. But from a principle standpoint, the state and the budgets that are for the towns, the state makes a commitment based on what they're going to give in both various municipal grants, Town Aid Road, Pequot Grant, and education cost sharing being the largest portion. And towns make their budgets, which by statute must be set by June 30th, with the mill rate has to be set by June 30th. There were several towns that decided to pass essentially a continuing resolution for 3 months to keep the town, authorize the treasurer to pay bills. But that's not good governance, and the state shouldn't be putting towns in that position, given that the state mandates by statute that the towns must pass budgets on a certain time schedule.
You're a good numbers guy. I imagine you're not surprised that you're facing a deficit projection going back.
No.
If you do indeed go back. On the other hand, you have a big rainy day fund because of some of the good tax numbers that came in.
Correct.
They might be temporary. So, what's your feeling of how the legislature has to think about tackling this thing?
Well, I think the challenge, the reason the projections on deficit is so large is twofold. One is rosy projections on revenue that never seem to materialize, and 2, we have a bad habit of sunsetting revenue at the end of each biennium. And so when OFA does their analysis on the budget for the 3rd year, the revenue that sunsets at the end of the 2-year projection is not available. And so that compounds the problem, makes it appear worse than, I won't say worse than it really is, because that's a bad problem in that the sunsetted taxes, whoever that's affected, whether it's business or personal, how do you plan? If every 2 years you have a question about whether that tax is going to continue or not, it's a very challenging place to continue to plan. So I think in front of us, as we're looking forward, you start with the challenge the next governor is going to face in the legislature is going to be the first off is the no layoff clause within the CBAC agreement. And so you have a relative fixed cost in the number of personnel that you have on staff currently. And so, that limits the options for balancing a budget without increasing revenue. So I think that's the first challenge that's in front of us. I think the second is the revenues that we have sunset. We have a habit of continuing to bring those on 2 more years at a time. It's likely that will have to continue in the next 2 years, but I think what we need to do is something that Bob Stefanowski really hasn't talked about, the zero-based budgeting process. Essentially, you start with a clean sheet of paper and have the departments defend, and that's really a small portion of the budget. It's probably on the order of 30, maybe 40% of what you call discretionary, given the limits of the CBAC agreement. I think the challenge we face is how do we manage that process. I think the good news is that we've constrained by the bonding cap that got codified, not so much in the agreement because it did get taken out of the budget agreement, but when the treasurer released the bonds most recently, that actually got codified in the bond covenant. So even though in the brokered agreement between the compromised budget, that portion of the spending cap, bonding cap, and the other parts that were to limit spending, the by bonding, put it in the bond covenant, it effectively mandates the $1.9 billion bonding cap as long as the term of those bonds. That is going to be another challenge faced by the legislature, both in the Finance Committee and the Appropriations Committee, because part of the strategy that was in the budget related to transportation involved additional general obligation bonds beyond the special tax obligation bonds that are guaranteed by the STF, the Special Transportation Fund. So that limitation puts a challenge on what we can do in road and bridge maintenance, and we need to prioritize that as well. So there's a number of challenges structurally, given the limits that have been placed on the legislature. Rightly so, we finally defined the spending cap. We're only going to spend 95% of the revenue, which was in the budget process. So it's going to be a challenge. There's no doubt about it. It's going to be a challenge. I think that you're going to find that there's going to be a desire to use some portion of the rainy day fund for that. One of the things that the Republicans had proposed in their budget was to divide it in thirds. Essentially, a third of the revenue would be used for potentially for current budget related items. A third would be used to pay down the some part of the unfunded liability to the teachers and state employees retirement system, and then the final third would go into the rainy day fund. That was something that was not accepted by the majority party and was not put in there. But that would be a concept of how you don't take everything out of the rainy day fund and take it to zero, as you have some kind of a policy like that where you're dedicating only a portion of it to current expenses. You're paying off your unfunded liabilities with a portion, but leaving a substantial part of it there in the rainy day fund.
Ben, I don't want to monopolize here.
So I wanted to ask you about, last session, Senate Bills 7 and 9, approved by General Assembly, signed by the governor. They call for a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and for ramping up the state's renewable energy, reliance on renewable energy.
Sure.
Correct me if I'm wrong, I think you voted against those?
I'd have to go back and look at the language of the bill.
Okay.
In general, the challenge is that's in anything to do with green energy in the state. The majority of our green energy comes from Millstone. And at the time, if I'm remembering the timing correctly, Millstone was not a part of that discussion. And it's kind of an interesting situation in that there's a push, rightly so, to get to solar and other renewables, and there have been a big push, and a successful push actually, particularly in eastern Connecticut, to have that happen. The challenge, though, is that somewhere in the order of 94 or 96% of our green energy comes from nuclear. I said at that time, Millstone and Dominion had made the case that they were essentially in jeopardy of having to close a facility due to fiscal constraints, and that would have been a challenge. So, not really going back and look at the language and the specifics of it. That would be the kind of the full picture related to green and renewable energies that were out there.
Do you think the state's on the right track and regulators are on the right track in terms of considering Millstone a competitor with low emissions and zero carbon?
I think that the challenge we face, I know that if I recall correctly recently, the recommendation was that they were in, the word's not duress, but the phrase that they used, that it was critical they didn't have to wait till 2023. But I have not seen that PURA has accepted that recommendation yet. So we're still waiting to see that. One of the things that was frustrating from the legislative standpoint is that PURA added that condition, which was not in the language of the bill, nor was it the intent of the legislature. So it's encouraging that the recommendation has been made to designate them at risk, and hopefully PURA will take that on board. The challenge really becomes if you lose Millstone as an asset providing power, you lose between 15 and 30% of your electrical power to the ISO, which is basically all of New England, and the natural gas industry made their case that should just happen. The reality, though, the practical reality is that there's not sufficient natural gas capacity to make up the loss of that power distribution capability. So I think in the near term, that is something we need to maintain as we plan for and migrate to renewables, natural gas, and other cleaner forms of, or not cleaner, clean forms of providing energy if we're going to allow a nuclear power plant to close.
I want to talk about the Republican candidate for governor, Bob Stefanowski. For much of his campaign, he was led with this idea that Connecticut can go back to having no income tax. He'd like to get rid of it. He gave a recent interview with the Connecticut Mirror with much more nuanced discussion of that, saying that the first 2 years he imagined will be devoted to trying to stabilize Connecticut fiscally, at which point, if the economy's picking up, revenues are coming in, then they can begin work would begin on trying to phase back the income tax rates. Your thoughts on that whole approach and whether the income tax should be a target?
Well, I think that if you look at the Fiscal Accountability Working Group report that was delivered to the legislature April or May of this year, they talked about essentially reforming how revenue is generated for the state, which had a reduction in income tax rates down from a high rate of 6.99 down to, I think, 5 3/4, and a low rate down to 3, increasing the deductibility, or not the minimum threshold before income tax took effect. I think that's a more practical approach. By process, how I would take this is, if I was going to make that as my goal is to eliminate or substantially reduce the income tax, by process, what I would do is go back and look at, what did the state government look like in 1991 before the income tax was enacted? How many agencies, what were they thought? And then what does it look like today? There are 3 things, essentially 2 actions that would drive that. One is a federal mandate, which come in 2 flavors, and the other is the state deciding that they were going to increase spending for whatever reason. And the reason I say the federal mandate come in 2 flavors is, one comes with funding, and if you take the money, generally there are strings attached. The other is just a mandate that you must comply with regardless of who pays for it, by the state unfunded mandate in that case. So by looking at those 3 things, those 3 pockets, you can then determine that obviously if you take if it's an unfunded mandate from the federal government, you don't have a really choice in many respects. If it's a funded mandate where they give partial funding to a program, you can make a choice. Do I want to take the funding and continue the program or not? And then the third piece is what we've done to ourselves, which would be state programs that have been grown since then. And once you have that, then you can do an analysis of those 3 pockets and then determine, are there things that were created 20 years ago that to serve a particular purpose, that reason doesn't exist anymore? And you look at doing away with those agencies, those functions, consolidating agencies. But that's kind of the process that you'd have to go through to determine how you can reduce the revenue requirements by doing the analysis of how state government has grown since before that revenue was here. I would say it's challenging. I think that I've heard Bob Stefanowski call it an aspirational goal as opposed to a hard goal. But I think that the more prudent approach is more what the Fiscal Accountability Working Group brought forward on the revenue part of their analysis. That's a more prudent and practical approach. But I still think by process, that's what you need to go do, because we've grown the number of agencies, we've grown the cost of government in general. You need to do that analysis in order to have an objective measure of what's changed, that's driven up the cost of state government. Without that, it's all in the abstract, and you really need to have a better understanding from a process perspective how to deal with the growth of government and really analyze what's changed and why. As I said, many things, sometimes you have a problem that exists today and you bring a program in, and as we see, once a program started in government, it's very, very difficult and highly unusual if it ever goes away. And so, but the problem that originated that program, that agency to solve, may not exist anymore. But it takes on a life of its own and it never really goes away. So that's what I would do as far as a process perspective, to look at why a government has grown, how it's grown in cost, and then do that analysis.
Interesting. My bet is a lot of it's education. But
It probably is. I mean,
Yeah,
there,
would be-
but I think that's from a pure engineering standpoint, process, project management. You know, my background in project management. That's how you do that analysis, and it should be informative in the sense of you look at particularly the things the state has done without a federal mandate requirement. Why did we do that? You know, go back in the enacting legislation. It was likely designed to solve a problem. Does that problem still exist? Did we solve that problem? You know, if we did, why are we still have the agency? What is it doing? Those are the kinds of questions we need to ask in order to be able to
Yeah.
determine.
From a fiscal conservative's point of view, that sounds potentially more fruitful than zero-based budgeting.
Well, I think that's more realistic because, you know, I think zero-based budgeting by process has a benefit in the sense that it requires of department heads or commissioners to defend their budget. That's really the value in zero-based budgeting is it says you have a clean sheet of paper, you don't have anything from the previous year, define why you need what you need by function. You know, whether that be by statute or by policy, whatever that requirement is. I think that's somewhat what Governor Malloy tried to do when he asked each agency to say, you know, what would a 10% cut look like? Some of the agencies did that exercise. Others just said it's this amount of money and didn't say how they would, you know, actually enact it. But that was part of, you know, his budget process that he used, I think, 2 cycles ago, where he asked them to look at what a 10% cut would look like. And that can be an informative process and discipline to understand, you know, what agencies see as, you know, the things that they could either do without or streamline to make decisions that are informative and are least impactful to the residents of the state.
I'd be fascinated to see what that came up with.
Well, it's public now. We in fact, the Republicans used many of those ideas in our budget
No,
proposal.
but I mean, you're right,
for-
you're going back to 91, saying
Right.
pre-income tax Connecticut, yeah.
I think you'll find that there's 20 or 30 new agencies that have been formed. You'll find that there's a growth in employees, maybe not. We may find that there's just a transition, but those are all things that I think are informative and would help to make a better decision than what we have been doing, which is I need to cut $100 million. Okay, I'll trim a little bit here and a little bit there without understanding the impact, which is really making policy by dollars as opposed to setting the policy that is right for the state.
Where do you come down on $15 minimum wage and paid family leave? Big issues for the Democratic side, I know.
They are. I think that the minimum wage, $15 minimum wage, is not something that I would support. I think that the market determines what is affordable. I think it's ironic that when we were at $7.75, we increased to $10.10 and phased, that McDonald's was offering starting salaries at $8.50 an hour. So you're talking about the entry level job that many of us in high school took at paying more than minimum wage at the time when our minimum wage was $7.75. So the market had already driven that up to what it is. I think the challenge is that we have changed the definition in the rhetoric from minimum wage to a living wage. And we have assumed that people are living on minimum wage, and the numbers are very small that are actually on minimum wage. And minimum wage was never designed to feed a family, which is kind of the rhetoric that's being thrown around. So the challenges we're seeing in cities like Seattle, who enacted a $15 minimum wage, as you're seeing businesses move out of the city. You're seeing businesses close down. You're seeing automation come in. The reality is that business will survive. And if you tell me I have to pay a person $15 an hour, and there's something that I can automate, like McDonald's is doing with ordering as an example, if I can automate that process, I have no encumbrance for health care, for retirement, for anything, and I have no salary. I pay the cost of the machine, and so you will see greater automation come into play with an increase in the salary that's artificially set by the government.
How about paid family leave? Like you see a lot of states going to that. Certainly, Europe, it's pretty universal that if something happens in the family, crisis-wise, you don't lose your paycheck for several weeks.
Well, the challenge with any of those programs is how do you pay for them? I mean, that's really what it comes down to. The mandate, once again, it becomes a mandate on businesses to support, and much like minimum wage, if they cannot drive the price of their service up sufficiently to cover the cost, then you decrease an employee. Or if you set an artificial threshold of anybody over 30 hours a week is required to be covered under paid family medical leave, then you will have a number of increased part-time employees. Instead of having one 40-hour week, I'll hire two 20-hour week positions because I have to have my business survive. That's really the challenge that we have in enacting some of those things, is they become mandates on business. And the larger businesses can generally absorb that, and many of them have programs already established. But when you're talking about enacting some of the things that we've done over the last 2 terms that I've been in office, you get down to some of the things on 3 employees or more. So that means every little landscaping company that has 4 employees now has a requirement for any of the mandates that come up. Many of those have been proposed as amendments, but have not passed. They've remained at either 50 or 75. But even with that, you're talking about a relative small business with margins that really can't support those programs, and so you end up having stunting growth. So if you set a threshold of 50 employees, then if I'm sitting at 49 employees and I have to, pay for, as an example, 9 days of mandated sick time, which we passed recently. If I hire that 50th employee, I now have to hire 3 because I've now incurred 450 man days of potential sick time that I have to account for to maintain the same throughput in progress. Now, if I'm growing rapidly and in the next 2 years I'm going to be at 100, I'd probably do that. If I'm growing slow and I'm hiring a 2 or 3 more a year, I'm probably going to stop growing and I'm going to stay at 49 employees. And I'm not going to hire that 50th employee and incur the mandate cost of 452, basically 2 man years of cost, average salary $50,000 a year, burdened. We talk $150,000, $200,000 cost, and no additional revenue coming in, because likely most of the small businesses can't increase their costs sufficiently to overcome that.
Could it be incentivized in any way so that you say some companies decide to do it? Could government play a role in incentivizing perhaps companies taking that initiative?
Sure, you could, but you still have to pay for it, which means you have to take revenue from somewhere else, or you have to increase revenue and take taxes out of people's pockets. So that's the challenge. Is it's not a zero-sum game. It's not free, and so even if you incentivize it, you have to take money from somewhere. And if you're looking to take more money out of the economy and run it through government, you're further hampering the ability of the economy in Connecticut to grow. I've always said we don't have to be competitive with Texas or Alabama or Iowa, but we're not even competitive with our neighbors. We've seen a migration of businesses that are near the borders of Massachusetts and Rhode Island move across the border. They still live in Connecticut, but their business is now in the other state. Why? Because it's easier to do business there. The costs are lower, and so which is a dramatic turn from Massachusetts, which was a place to escape from, now being a lower cost state to run a business. That's something we have to turn around. We need to be competitive with our neighbors, and right now we're not.
And one last thing we're asking everyone is the question on tolls. Yay or nay on whether they think tolls is the right way to go, as many other states have, to generate revenue for transportation.
I think the first question we have to ask is, do you need the money? And that's the first question, and that has not been the first question that's been asked. The plan that the Republicans have put forward first in 2015 and have updated as recently as February of this year, Prioritize Progress, looks at the existing revenue and the projections that DOT has put out about maintaining the infrastructure. And based on the revenue projections over 30 years, there's sufficient revenue in the existing lines. Now, one of the things that the governor has said is there's one study out there that shows that within the next 30 years or 50 years, half the cars on the roads are going to be electric. And so we have to do something today. Well, I will tell you that you don't make policy today for something that may happen in 30 or 50 years. So if we see a decline in revenue, which we have not seen a substantial decline, or we see a point where there's a cliff we fall off because there has been a transition, then we need to look at other sources of revenue for the roads and bridges. The challenge really becomes on this particular topic is the only two proposals that have been delivered to DOT, haven't been delivered to the legislature for discussion yet. One looks at the corridor between New York State border and New Haven, which was, I think, 12 gantries on 95 and 13 on the Merritt Parkway. And then the other plan was anywhere from 70 to 88 gantries all across the state, basically every interstate and state highway everywhere, a gantry every 4 miles. The argument from the proponent is, well, all our surrounding states have tolls, therefore we must too. Well, the reality is nobody's putting tolls in like are being described in the plans that have been proposed. They are, if you look at the surrounding states, Rhode Island has 2 tolls on 2 bridges. They just instituted truck tolling. And then you look at Massachusetts, 1 bridge and the Mass Pike. New York has a few bridges and tunnels, and then the New York Thruway. And nowhere, ever, anywhere in the country are you tolling every road that is in existence in a state. The rate also was somewhere in the order of 4 times the rate per mile that has been proposed in other states. So those are the things that are dramatically different in the proposals. And the other challenge we face in enacting tolls in the state of Connecticut isn't the technology of gantries and electronic tolling. It's the fact that we don't have really any limited access highways. So if you look at the consistency across the country, limited access highways are where they put in tolling. The other aspect of this is congestion tolling. The way that the DOT has talked about and the governor's talked about congestion tolling is essentially taking an entire highway, tolling it, and then changing the toll based on a congestion-based pricing model. The challenge with that is that's not the way congestion tolling is enacted anywhere else in the state, in the country. When they put in congestion tolling, they generally put in another lane, make it an HOV lane for either 2 or 3, and then if you want to, as a single driver, pay the congestion tolling, you can then ride in the HOV lane. I'm not convinced, and nor has anybody asked the Federal Highway Authority what the impact would be on our highway funds if we enacted something, even in congestion tolling, that is a departure from how it's been enacted across the country. When we took tolls away from our highways, the federal government substantially increased our highway funds for paying for our road maintenance. Nobody's asked the federal government what would happen even if we enacted tolls in any fashion. Will the revenue that is driven by tolls offset the loss in revenue from the federal government? Those are all questions that have to be asked before we even consider moving forward on anything related to tolls because of the impact with the federal government and the highway funds. And none of those questions have been asked. I think those are huge holes in any process for any advocate who's trying to bring tolls into the state.
Ben, we're getting up to our half hour. I don't know if there's
I had read last election cycle, you mentioned in an article, interview with Nate Lynch, who covered Ledger, that you had introduced a few years ago, a bill that would have created a bridge program that would have helped students transfer into technical schools.
Right.
I was curious to tell us a little bit more about that program and if anything's gone further with that.
Right. So where that came from is actually my 2012 campaign. I talked with Brian Mignaud, who's a constituent up in Preston. He's the principal at Ellis Tech up at Danielson. And he shared the success they've had in their program with 10 trades, et cetera. And I looked at that, and over about 2 to 3 months of knocking doors, I ended up at a door of a teacher from Grosso Tech in Ledyard. And I shared this concept of, essentially what we do is we're asking 8th graders, essentially, do you want to go to college or do you want to swing a hammer? And I understand technical schools have engineering and other things as well, but that's the perception of many parents, that if you go to a technical school, you're going to go into a trade and you're going to be a carpenter or something like that, that you're not going to get to go to college. And that's also a misnomer, because there are paths to college out of technical schools as well. But I pitched this because, if you come from a family where the parents see the financial outcome of their family as determinant by the fact that either they didn't go to college or they went to college not right out of high school but later in life, they want their child to have the best. And we've been telling kids for a couple of decades that if you don't go to college, you're not going to make it in this world. So the pressure on that child to make that decision at the end of 8th grade is immense to go into high school. Well, at the end of freshman year, and these numbers were brought out when I saw a report from Ledyard High School, when they come out of middle school, and you look at the three levels of education, 1, 2, and 3, 3 being the state minimums, 2 being what they call college prep, and 1 being advanced, you see that coming out of middle school in Ledyard, about 75% of the students were in level 1 and 2, and about 25% in level 3. Sophomore year and beyond, it was 60-40. And you say, well, what is the difference? Well, the difference is who's assessing them. So the students coming out of middle school are being assessed by their middle school teachers. And if somebody's on the cusp between one level and another, and I would do the same thing, you want to challenge them so you move them up. Well, after freshman year, you know where their ability is, and so they settle into an appropriate level of education for the child. The challenge is once you're into the traditional education program and the traditional high school, there's no escape. There's no way to go anywhere else. The technical high schools do not recruit unless they have a hole. So if they have, as an example, if they had 4 slots for plumbing in their school, they would go find 4 students. But it isn't an elective choice of a student after their freshman year. So what I proposed was, and what I learned was that they, in the technical high school, you're in the trade starting second semester freshman year. So I proposed this bridge program to take care of that trade work during the summer and establish relationships with local contractors, electricians, plumbers, construction, or whatever is the appropriate mix. And say, for example, you have to do 3 trades over the summer, 3 weeks with an electrician, 3 weeks with a plumber, 3 weeks, pick your 3 different trades. They give them a sheet and say, you go here's your list of contractors that have reached agreements with us to support this program. And you come back in August, you demonstrate that you've taken care of the trade requirement, and you will be admitted into the technical high school. I even proposed even after sophomore year, and this teacher said, well, that would be really challenging. And so my point was, is it better for that child after sophomore year to spend 2 more years in a system that's going to fail them because they can't get a job out of a traditional high school and they're not going to college, whether that be because of ability or finances or whatever, or give them the option of going to 3 more years of the technical high school, doing that same bridge program over the summer. So effectively 5 years of high school. But when they leave the technical high school, they have a trade, they can go into a job, and they can actually support themselves. And so that's the concept. And so I proposed that in my first term in 14, a 15 session. It was not taken up. I proposed it again in the short session. Again, it was not taken up. So I met with the commissioner of the technical high school that summer to let her know that I was going to propose it the following year, to give her time. Because typically, you don't want to surprise them because it's a major structural change, but to give her 6 months to look at this process so that when they come in before the legislature to have this debated, they'll at least have thought about what they have. Because otherwise, you have a committee hearing in March or April. The commissioner comes in and says, I'll take a look at it, and now you're out of session, and it basically comes back the following session. So I was trying to preempt that process to give them time to look at it ahead of time. And I think that's one thing. The other aspect that came out of this was a discussion related to that we have an asset of the technical high schools that are only being used essentially 8 hours a day for one session. But the physical property is an asset for the state that has an ability, should be used potentially for a second class of high school students or even an adult learning that's formalized. There are some programs that are in certain areas of the state. I think in the Waterbury area, they use the technical high school in the evening for adult programs, or a hybrid program where they spend 3 or 4 classes in the traditional high school and then after lunch go to the technical high school. So there's lots of flexibility and possibility here, but I think fundamentally we need to be focused on the students, be focused on what's right for them. And the other aspect of this I learned is we need to really start in 6th or 7th grade talking about this decision that's going to be made in 8th grade. We really wait till second semester in 8th grade and say, okay, make your decision, you have about a week, figure it out. And that's not really fair to the family or the student to really understand what the options are at the technical high school and find out what's best for the student. So I think it's not a simple solution, but I think it's something that has merit in the sense that we need to look at what is best for the student. And you really don't know what your success is going to be in traditional high school, really till after freshman year, even sophomore year, to understand, because there's a fundamental difference between even middle school and high school in the challenges that are presented and the expectations of the child.